Good.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the GSE storage webinar from IATA. We would like to start in a few minutes, but before, we would like to go over some housekeeping rules. Your microphone is automatically muted. If you wish to submit questions, please kindly use the Q&A box located at the bottom right of your screen. You must select Send to all panelists, not specific individuals. Q&A questions will only be visible to all once they have been answered. You will only be able to see your own questions. In addition, we have a feedback option which you can use to share your reactions during the presentation. It's a little icon that looks like a microphone. The icon looks like a microphone. Lastly, we'll be conducting 2 polls during the webinar. Once they open, please ensure to answer the question and make sure to click on the Submit button in order for the answer to be calculated. Now we will go ahead and get started. So I'm transferring the floor to Joseph. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon from Montreal. Good evening to wherever you are. Good morning, wherever your country is. Thank you for being on the call. My name is Joseph Swedan, and I am the head of ground operations at IATA. I would like to welcome you to the first of our IATA ground operations webinars focused on helping in this difficult time. Over the past couple of weeks, the ground operations team has been working with various industry stakeholders and other IATA colleagues to compile a set of practical guidelines to assist with operations and the orderly shutdown process as our industry rapidly goes to minimum, or in some cases, zero operations. These guidelines are reviewed and updated as we get more information, with the result that we are already on bulletin number 2. Links to the guidelines I provided here, and again at the end of the webinar in case you haven't already accessed them. These guidelines are of necessity generic in nature, designed to be widely applicable to assist the greatest number of users with the essentials to get them through this tough time. The topics covered at this point are ground handling guidelines of COVID-19 with the recommendation for passenger handling, ramp handling, ULD handling, aircraft cleaning, and catering handling, ground support equipment procedures, and ground handling training. We have also developed a separate document that deals with the highly complex topic of carrying cargo in passenger cabin. Feedback from industry on this initiative has been overwhelmingly positive, and we are on the right track. What we hope to do with this webinar is to get a better idea of the challenges being faced by the industry in a specific aspect of the operations, as well as assess the need for additional guidelines and possible training. Based on how this webinar and its second session on Wednesday, April the 15th, we are planning to run webinars on other ground operations topic in the coming weeks. Please keep a lookout on the ground operation pages at IATA website, www.iata.org. And now, to deal with the specific topic of the ground support equipment storage, I would like to invite one of my team, Steve Savage, as a moderator for this session. Steve, over to you. Steve? Sorry,
Yeah. Good afternoon. I'm Steve Savage, Senior Analyst, Ground Operations, IATA. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our panelists this afternoon. Kevin Cecil, Engineering Manager Loaders at JBT. Lee Hui, GSE Manager at WestJet and Encore. We've also added Romy Ulloa, Senior Manager Operations Projects SFO IATA, who can help us if there are any fuel-related questions. And she's had a bit of trouble with her laptop, so she's phoning in. If we're unable to get her, then we will try to send the questions to her later and address them in that way. I would just like to give a quick overview of the GSE parts of the guidelines that Joseph mentioned. The primary aim of the GSE guidelines are to preserve the GSE fleet in a safe, fully functional condition for a quick return to safe operations with least possible cost. In the guidelines, these are covered under 3 headings: preparation, storage, and return to service. Unfortunately, I think the luxury of preparation was probably denied us as the industry scrambled to park equipment and then left us wondering what we should be doing to properly store GSE for what could be a long time and how this was going to be done on minimal or non-existent staff. This is why we have grouped preparation with storage for the purposes of this webinar. The guidelines were developed and vetted by some of our industry stakeholders and contain practical recommendations on various aspects under each of the headings. Before we get started with discussion with our panelists, I would like to ask participants to start submitting the questions to the panel. This is done in the Q&A box to the right of your screen. And please remember that you can only see your question and the questions that have been answered. Because it is likely we won't be able to deal with all the questions, we have a team in the background analyzing and consolidating the questions. I will be reading these questions or points raised to the panelists for their response. And we're going to be doing this in 2 sections. One is this one now, which is to do with the storage and preparation. And then the next section will be on return to service. To get things started on storage and preparation, I'd like to ask Kevin for the key points of GSE storage from the manufacturer's point of view. Kevin.
Thanks, Steve. We have received quite a few calls from customers looking for guidance on what should be done with their equipment during this downtime. While we can make suggestions on what to do, this will come down to a variety of factors, such as how long will this be for? What are my environmental conditions? How many pieces of equipment do I have? How many technicians are available? And is there any budget to do this work or even needed repairs? With that in mind, here are 3 basic areas we believe you should focus on. First and foremost is safety. Always make sure you're taking actions to avoid hazards now and in the future. You can do this by wearing appropriate PPE, such as gloves, safety glasses, etc. Following any operating instructions you have from the vehicle manufacturer and/or training guidelines from your team. If you need help assistance in getting those training manuals or operation information, please reach out to those manufacturers. Think about where to park your equipment. What's the best environment possible? And always chalk the wheels. Things like theft, animal damage, rain, snow, sun, sand, are all things that can damage equipment. Think about covering them if possible. And identify equipment that is okay to use versus ones that are needing repair. Secondly is the equipment storage portion. What do we do with all this equipment that's sitting around the ramp? First, we want to look at our fluids. What are our environmental conditions? What might freeze? What might be other issues? Do we need to top it off or drain the fluids? Fuel. Always best practice to top it off, or if it's going to be a while without use, add fuel stabilizer. Grease may be forgotten, but lubricating grease points will assist in making sure corrosion, dirt, damage, and moisture do not get into those critical points. Batteries. Make sure there's at least a partial charge on them. Make sure all lead acid batteries have proper water levels, and disconnect all batteries that can be reached. Corrosion. Coat any exposed surfaces or control the environmental conditions if possible. Tires, we'd like to inflate those to their maximum recommended pressure, or if possible, block the vehicles up to avoid flat spots on those. And then we want to account for all of your equipment and its condition. Make a plan for any needed work, parts, and labor. That way you'll know if you need to repair it, scrap it, or replace it before going back into service. And that leads us to our third point, which is eventually we do want to return this equipment to service, and how do we get it going again? Creating a pre-operational checklist will be key to this. Many manufacturers' manuals include information on this. Inspect for damage, missing parts, fluid levels. Complete recommended maintenance based on the time or engine hours. Verify full and safe functionality before putting back into service. Many manufacturers will also be available and can assist in this if needed. And finally, do operators need to be retrained or certified on equipment and usage policies? Steve, I'll hand this back over to you for now.
Thank you, Kevin. Lee, as an airline and a user of GSE, if you could give us a bit of your thoughts on the key points on GSE storage, that'd be great.
Certainly, Steve. So right now, WestJet has far more equipment than we require to support our current operations. So we've looked at different ideas. We've decided the best plan for now is we're going to use a rotation model to try to balance usage across our fleet rather than just have a bunch of units run up while others are sitting in the graveyard. We intend to park the units that aren't required and every couple of weeks rotate them back into service. Or as a unit comes due for PMI based on hours, that one will come offline, another one will go into service. Another thing we've done is we've halted our calendar PM intervals. Just knowing that we're going to have such low usage of equipment, it seemed prudent to stop that spend. One thing I will note there is that we do have a bi-weekly check performed on all of our equipment by mechanics to make sure it stays in a good operating condition. So if you don't have those in place, you might want to revisit the calendar PMIs, but for us, we're fairly confident that will work. This plan is evolving and flexible depending on how long this timeline goes on. None of us really understand or know when is this going to be back in use and how long is this going to last. So we're sort of going with a flexible, evolving plan right now. Some of the challenges we've faced doing this is, getting operations on board. I think folks aren't used to the concept of not being able to take whichever belt loader or bag tractor is sitting there that they can see. And so we had some challenges in the beginning where we would park stuff and come back the next day and find out that it had all been returned to service by the agents. And so it took a little bit of back and forth and kind of getting operations to understand, the reason behind it, and not so much the leadership level, but the actual agents. It's a total change in culture for WestJet. The other thing we learned is that we had to actually revisit what really was required for each plane, because, for instance, normally we would have 2 belt loaders designated to an airplane, but that's based on normal loads of 80% or so. Right now, we have nowhere near those loads on airplanes, so most flights, 1 belt loader is more than enough because, like a lot of people out there, you got 2 or 3, maybe 5 bags going onto an airplane. So we've had to revisit and been able to pull things further down from that. One thing we did figure out after a couple initial falters trying to get this started is that the best plan that we came up with is we actually went and pulled out an airport map and we designated parking areas and clearly communicated that to our agents that these items parked in this area are available for use. These items are spares that if you need them, you can take them. And this area over here, you don't touch it unless it's dire, and then you call GSE maintenance and we get one back into service. By doing that, it seems to have helped us stabilize a little bit. And we're still very much in the process of getting this fully under control as, our schedules are adjusting further and things like that. So we definitely aren't done this at all. But we're working on it, and our plan right now for any units that are going to be put into kind of offline status, we're just hoping to do the bare minimum of make sure the fluids are topped up, switch off the batteries or disconnect as needed, check the tires, and then chalk them so that the park brakes don't end up seized. Hoping with our rotation model that we won't have to go further than that, but like I say, this is a flexible, evolving plan. Same thing with the return to service. If this is short term and we get away with our rotation plan, return to service will not be a challenge. if we do end up going to completely stored equipment, we'll revisit and develop further plans as needed. You know, I think the big message for me is we need the flexibility right now to ramp up and down as needed. And none of us know. I don't want to end up in a situation where I can't get the operation going again quickly enough. So I'm hesitant to put everything offline, but that's what we're doing for now. So thanks, Steve.
Thanks very much, Lee. Thank you, Lee and Kevin, for your insights. Before we get into the question and answers, we have the first of those two polls. And then just want to remind you that the poll answers are not traceable back to the attendee. You can click on the answer that you want, and remember to click on submit to get your result in. And then there's a minute or so to complete the poll, and then we will display the result. And now we're going to get on with a couple of the question and answers. And I'm going to, right. First of the questions we have, what is the recommended procedure for equipment to include PCA? Sorry, I'm learning here. Yeah, what is the recommended procedures for equipment to include PCA and GPU in regards to storage and testing requirements upon return to service? Kevin and Lee.
Steve, this is Kevin. I think the biggest thing there would be following that restart procedure. So for many JBT products, and I'm sure many manufacturers as well, in your manual, there'll be information about what to do when returning an item to service. If you had proper storage at the start point, you should hopefully have a good piece of equipment. Obviously, putting air into the aircraft is something we want to make sure we're doing properly, so making sure there aren't any foul odors and things like that might be an additional piece of sanitary work that needs to be done. Lee, do you have any additional comments?
I was just going to add that we actually haven't gone to parking PCAs and GPUs yet. The challenge for us is we have a whole bunch of airplanes parked all over the place that need that equipment for maintenance activities and things like that. So we haven't parked anything yet.
Okay, thanks for that, Lee. Next question we have here is, should batteries on electric equipment be charged or drained? And I think we need to get into that a little bit on the point of view of differences between lead acid batteries and also the lithium batteries or new high-tech batteries.
Steve, I think on the batteries, the best recommendation there would be is to do proper maintenance. So one, with any lead acid batteries that you may have to fill with electrolyte or water, you'll want to make sure those are the proper and correct levels and charge the battery somewhere between 70 and 90%. You'll want to also make sure that battery is disconnected from anything that could draw the power down. On lithium batteries, there'll be no maintenance that needs to be done to the insides of the batteries, but again, you should charge that somewhere between the 70 and 90% range and make sure it's disconnected from any power draws.
Great. Lee, anything to add to that? Yeah, I know that you've got a fleet of lithium batteries there as well.
Yeah, so the lithium tractors, the most ideal is to store them at 50%, but that's a fair challenge if you've got real large format batteries and lots of them to try to get them drawn down that low. The reality is if you are able to turn off the battery at a master switch or something like that and park it, they will be fine. The other option with lithium is you can leave them plugged into the charging interfaces because they're smart chargers. They will manage those batteries. The one caution for anyone that lives in colder climates is some of those batteries do have heaters in them, and make sure that those are turned off because what you'll do is come back to a fleet of dead lithiums, and that's expensive.
Yeah, thanks for that, Lee. Yeah, I think partly, I don't know if you completely covered it, but we have another question here. Is there a risk that disconnecting batteries compromises the integrity of the ECU and the PLC memories on certain equipment?
Steve, in many cases, the disconnecting the battery when properly done won't impact any of the memory on many of the PLCs, as those are retained variables. If things are off for a long enough period of time, it's possible, but I think for what we're looking for most people here of 3 months-ish, there should not be any issues with that. If there are other things that cause the issue to have communication losses or something else because of additional damage to the unit, that can be separate, but just disconnecting the battery should not cause an issue.
Okay.
I agree with Kevin on that. The worst case with those scenarios is that most of the ECUs will have a learning process where, you know, it may go into sort of stock fuel tables and stuff like that while it re-energizes and gets itself figured out again, but it won't impair the operation of the unit.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. I have another question here, moving off of the batteries. Is it necessary to keep the GSE under roof, or can we keep it under open sky?
I think that's really going to come down to the available space that everyone has. Not many people will have the opportunity to store everything indoors. Obviously, if you can put it indoors in a climate-controlled environment, that's going to be the best scenario you can have. If you are storing outside in an open environment, just take note of what items could be exposed either to extreme sunlight and UV rays, cold weather or temperatures, sand, things like that you may want to limit exposure to. So you may want to decide to cover certain things like control panels or seats or other things that you may on a normal habit cover during working environments. That's about all I can add to that one.
Lee, anything there?
Yeah, the only thing I was going to note there is that I had actually meant to mention it earlier, is that something that's on my mind is if you do have this vast field of stored GSE, I caution people to not forget that it's there, you know, and maybe do like a weekly walkthrough or, you know, every couple weeks at least, just to, you know, keep an eye out. Are tires going flat? Or, you know, are you starting to see birds nesting and things like that? Because if you can keep an eye on this stuff and get a hold of it as problems start to crop up, rather than come back to a laundry list of problems when you're done.
Okay. Then the other next question that I have here is, any recommendations or precautions to be taken for toilet service vehicles and water service vehicles during this situation?
Lee, I think I'll let you handle this one because I'm not sure what regulatory requirements may come into play for that.
Yeah, and that one I haven't looked into too much. I know we did have some guidance in the document that went out. We don't have enough equipment of that type to, you know, where we're going to have them offline for extended periods. Our normal process is that if something, like we do have one water cart as a backup in Calgary that isn't used frequently, and with that one, what we do is we make sure it's drained and let it dry completely. And then when we go to put it back into service, we sanitize it and before we use it. And that's been successful for us. Sanitize and test before use. For the LAV trucks, obvious one, make sure that you've dumped them of the stuff out of the plane. I would probably recommend either making sure the blue juice tank is drained or filled. Either way should be fine. And again, just, you know, any vents and things like that covered to keep vermin out, and you know, and again, just keep an eye on them.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Lee. Next question here. Has your SMS department, if you have one, gone through and completed a risk management analysis for parked equipment? If so, were there any major risks? What were they? How are you mitigating them?
I guess I'll answer that one since Kevin wouldn't apply to him. Valid point. You know, we actually had not done that. I think we've been focused on so many things at once here that, you know, we've just been, you know, doing what needs to be done. After this call, I'll revisit with our safety folks and see if that's something they feel that needs to have a risk assessment done or not.
Okay, thanks. Is there anything special we should be doing with fuel trucks? I think that's quite a hot topic at the moment, and I know we have some basic guidelines there. Is there anything that you have experience of there, Lee, and that Romy, if you want to jump in on that, that's also okay.
I'm going to let Rami answer that one. We, full disclosure, have one GSE fuel truck only that only has like 200-liter tanks on it. So we have no jet fuel equipment or anything like that.
Okay. Okay. I don't know that Romy can get hold of us. Okay. Thanks very much for that. Another question here: how can we disinfect the GSE machines during this pandemic to avoid further outbreak?
Steve, I think the best thing people can do from here is just general safe practices that you would see much as you would do at your house or in your office. Following any World Health Organization or CDC or government guidelines you have made in your area. But doing things like sanitizing things, if you have wipes, if you have gloves, face masks. This is kind of a unique scenario where we currently have. It's good practice for all of us for good hygiene, but thinking through those things, but also how to properly clean them and make sure you do things. Make sure you do things that will sanitize equipment if you are concerned about a virus being present rather than just maybe cleaning. Much like our hands, soap and water tend to work quite well when used in the proper scenarios. How that will work on surfaces such as steering wheels, gear shift selectors, car seats will be really dependent on how you wash that machine. But maintaining those same social practices we're all being encouraged to do now would be the best practice I can think of.
Yeah, well, I just remember we had thanks for that, Kevin. We had another caution in our guidelines, which mentioned if you've got open instrument panels, vehicles without cabs and that sort of thing, what should you be doing to protect those if they're stored out in the open?
Those you could cover up with, heavy plastic or something like that, or a piece of cardboard, just keeping in mind there's got to be secured so it doesn't become FOD. The reality is those units live outdoors anyway, so if they're stored, what's the difference between that and normal usage? So I don't think it's a huge concern.
Okay, so if I wrap them in plastic, then we wouldn't be troubled by condensation forming and that type of thing.
I don't think Lee's suggesting that you wrap the piece of equipment, Steve. I think what he's saying is if any of those surfaces where you're concerned about excessive sunlight, sand, rain, snow, things like that, animals being on them, putting some sort of a cover over the top that would limit that exposure is what's the recommended practice. But many of those pieces of equipment that are open cab items are intended to be in an outdoor environment and generally have surfaces and materials that are intended for that environment.
Okay, great, thanks. Next question here. Is it recommended to remove motor and hydraulic oils if 2 months pass and the equipment is still in storage?
I think, Steve, that's going to really come down to some of the suggestions I made earlier, is not knowing everyone's scenarios of how many pieces of equipment you have, how much manpower you have, and where you are in your PM cycles. If you've just changed the oil on those units prior to this event, there's probably no need to do that. If they were nearing their PM cycle, you may want to go ahead and make that. And that would be part of having a good pre-operational checklist and plan to bring equipment back into service.
Right.
Yeah, I wouldn't normally recommend removing fluids like oils from units. They will keep the condensation to a minimum inside the oil pans and things like that. And then there's also the risk of forgetting that you have no oil when you go to return to service. Of course, tags disappear and lists get lost. So I would caution against that myself.
Good. The next question, a bit related to that. How much time do you consider we must have engines running daily for not to have battery problems? Thank you. I think this is part of the sort of start up the engines and run them for a bit type of storage or parking operation.
So I do have a little experience on this, Canada being fairly remote here. A lot of our air starts we'd see very little hours on them, 120 hours and 10, 12 years on an air start. And so we have had challenges with that. And at one point in time, we used to try to combat the, batteries dying by starting and running the units. But what we found with the air starts is that the amount of energy to start the thing, you need to run it for 45 minutes to an hour just to charge the batteries up again. And the alternator is only there to really keep a battery topped up. It's not really meant to charge a depleted battery. It will do it, but it's not the most ideal charger. It's meant to balance the charge and the draw. So you're better to disconnect the batteries than to try to run them to maintain the engines. The only reason you would want to run the engines more so is to keep them from getting dried out. But if you are going to a long-term storage model, you may want to consider pulling plugs and putting fogging oil in cylinders and things like that if you're really planning for long-term storage.
Yeah. The only additional item, Lee, that I might have, if they have the ability, is that you can always use trickle chargers, and you could rotate those. So if you have a charger that you want to put on batteries after you've disconnected them just to kind of keep them topped off, you could do that rotation if you have that ability.
Yeah, valid.
Yeah, I can just see a whole lot of extension cables and trickle chargers all over a parking area. But yeah, well, that would be good. Sorry.
If you do disconnect the batteries, a normal lead acid battery will sit 6 months easily without being a problem, with no charge or anything, as long as it's disconnected completely.
Okay. Yeah. Then another question related to fuel again. Do we have any recommendations with hydrant service vehicles and fuel systems and pits?
Since we vehicle was, sorry, go ahead, Kevin.
Oh, I was going to say any vehicle that has fuel in it, right? So if you know it's going to be sitting idle for a significant period of time, adding some sort of a fuel stabilizer may be recommended. You can see that based on the type of fuel that you're using and or your manufacturer's manual and or the engine manufacturer's manual. The biggest concern you have there is that if diesel fuel or gasoline sits for too long of a period of time, it has the potential to gel up, which then can cause issues with your emissions or intake or injectors on the engines in the future.
Mm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry. I think this was more about the aircraft fuel, I think, and the fuel system pit and fuel pits at the airport. But no, I think the points you have there are valid for the vehicles themselves. I don't know if we can answer that one completely.
Yeah, I don't have any experience with large aircraft fueling vehicles or fuel farms. So as far as recommended practice for that, I would suggest probably reaching out to your fuel vendor and or the fuel supplier that maybe has some additional ideas of what to do.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
And Steve, I just want to clarify, just in case we confuse people, there is in no way, shape, or form are we saying to put any stabilizers into jet fuel vehicles for the jet fuel side. For the vehicle side, stabilizers are great. I do not know what you can do with the jet fuel side. I'm sorry.
Yeah, me neither. And but thank you very much for raising that, Lee. Good caution there. Next question is, my concern is the hydraulic pumps and water that will be caused by humidity. What will you recommend to make sure that the hydraulic pumps are kept in good working order?
I think the biggest thing there is many tanks have a breather on them that has a desiccant filter of some sort to try to keep the moisture level down. It won't keep 100% of it out, but will do some of that. As you do bring units back into service, that is something that you may have to consider if you're in an extremely rainy or humid environment where you think you've got moisture in your hydraulic supply, is looking at those return filters, looking at oil sampling to make sure those things are done properly, as the fluid is also a lubricity agent within those pumps and motors.
And just to add there, before you park it, I think if it's anywhere near due for hydraulic oil change, it's probably best practice, or if it's been some time since the last one. One of the things we learn here in Canada is that every winter you can tell which units didn't have good hydraulic oil because it gets water into it and freezes them.
Oh, yeah. Okay, thanks, Lee. Next question here. Should we rotate GSE every 7 or 10 days or more?
That's up to the individual operation. Whether it's 7 days or 10 days, I think either is fine. We all have to remember that people frequently go on vacation for 2, 3, 4 weeks at a time and leave their cars at the airport, and then nobody comes and does anything to those vehicles. So, if you're going to a 2-week or even 3 or 4 week interval, you want to keep an eye on the things that are parked. Like I say, to make sure that you don't come back to a field of dead batteries and flat tires. But otherwise, if something sits for a short period of time, which a month is not a long period of time for it to sit. So I don't think there's a hard and fast there.
Great, thanks. We're going to run out of time on this section, so I'm going to put one last question to you on that. And that is, are there any recommendations or specific procedures for de-icer preservation?
I think you need to make sure, obviously, you're looking at what's in your fluid tanks there. So whether you have water or glycol or a mixture of those, and making sure that's properly stored. If you're in an environment where it can still freeze, which luckily for many of us, that environment is slowly warming for the year, that needs to be properly dealt with and purged within the systems. But like everything else, making sure those systems that need lubricity or greasing and things are taken care of properly.
Right. Thanks very much for that, Kevin. Anything to add from the frozen north there, Lee?
Well, even up here, we do store de-icers on a regular basis, so we're just going to follow our normal storage that we do every summer, which some years is only a month or two, but yeah, we're same plan as always.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much. All right. Thank you very much for your help on those and storage questions there. And moving to a more positive side of things, we'd like to start taking a look at return to service. And so I'd like to ask the audience to start sending their questions in the question and answer box related more to return to service. Kevin, and could you give us some points of view from the manufacturer as to return to service?
Well, I think much like I mentioned before, Steve, the big thing here is making sure that you have a plan. With this extended shutdown, it may make us an opportunity for everyone to take a roll call or an accounting of all their equipment and assess what its current condition is. Part of that assessment should be whether you can repair it, whether you should scrap it, or whether you should replace that equipment. If you choose that it is good to go or that it can be repaired, go through those items that need to be done. So inspect for general issues with the machine. Make sure you replenish or replace fluids based on your schedules and how long it may have been. Inspect any items for damage, cracks, or dry rot that you might have, inflating tires. You may want to also sample some of your fluids. So hydraulic fluid could be one, or fuel, just to make sure that it's in good working order if you're concerned about that. And then just having a consistent checklist. Many manufacturers' manuals have information on a pre-operational checklist. And if you follow those guidelines, you'll generally have a good startup procedure.
Great, thanks. Lee, as a user, what sort of plans have you been thinking about or working on in what is probably now quite a slack period for you, and how has this been influenced by decisions for unit rotation or exercising?
Yeah, I mean, if we can keep with the rotational model, like I mentioned before, going back to service is not a huge issue because everything's effectively stayed in service on significantly reduced usage. If we do end up going to a full parked, then at that point in time, it's going to be effectively reversing everything you've done. So if you've put it on blocks, take it off blocks, and then you've got to, if you put fogging oil in the engine, you have to follow instructions for cleaning that out. Depending on what status you put the equipment away at, if it was serviced or not, how long has it sat? That is one thing. If you do end up with your GSE sitting for 6 to 12 months or longer, even if it did have an oil change when it went away, it probably needs a new one to go back into service. And those are a lot of things that individual organizations are going to have to figure out on their own as to, how far into their plan did they have to go. returning to service, it should hopefully be straightforward. But the one thing I was going to state is that, I think it's wise that at least every unit has gone through with at least a basic safety check and operational check to make sure that nothing is seized up and, the wheels all still spin properly and that sort of stuff.
And then once you get it moving again, you just drive it a short distance and make sure that it actually stops, of course.
Yes, of course, brakes are also valid. And I did mean to mention before, it's a little bit off topic on this one, but brake fluid is another one that if you have units that are due for brake fluid changes or have been a long time since a brake fluid change, it's good practice to change that before you put them into long-term storage because there is water in brake fluid that wrecks the systems as well.
Yeah, it's hygroscopic, of course. It absorbs water, right?
That's what it's meant to do, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Good. Well, before we get into the Q&A, the questions that we've had from the attendees, we have another question and answer poll. Yeah, sorry, another poll here. Again, we'd like to point out that the poll answers are not traceable back to the attendee. Click on the answer that you want and don't forget to click submit to get your result in. And we have a minute or so in which to complete that. And we really appreciate your feedback so that IATA can better help you. Okay. Moving to the questions here.
Hey, Steve, while we're waiting for a couple of those questions to come in from the audience, one thing I would also like to make sure we mention is that we need to think about the people who will be maintaining and operating these pieces of equipment as well, not just the equipment. While those people have not, in all cases, been put to the side like the machines have, we need to make sure they're properly trained, equipped, and certified when they come back. And because of this unique scenario that we've had, also making sure they know how to report issues and then check for any safety functions or training that may be needed and how to watch out for themselves and their peers.
Good point there. And I'm just taking a look through these questions. Yeah, we a couple of questions here. How do we preserve tires, fully inflated or not? That's more about the storage, but also, of course, affects the return to service. You don't want to have a whole lot of flat tires when we're trying to put everything back into service there. Is there any other than keeping it fully inflated? Is there any other preservation we should be doing?
That's another environmental, depending on where you live. Here in Canada, if you're reasonably shaded from the sun, we don't tend to rot tires too quickly here. If you're in a much hotter, drier, harsher climate, you may have different issues than we do. You can try to cover tires and things like that, but one of the biggest keys is making sure that they don't end up sitting on flats, because if you do that, they'll be wrecked.
Okay.
I think another point, Steve, real quick there too, is if people did take a measure to inflate the tires at a higher than normal, but up to the maximum recommended pressure, when they go back into service, you want to make sure you've checked those tire pressures on pneumatic tires, that they're in the operating condition, not overinflated or underinflated.
Yeah, and of course, it's a good idea to keep the vehicle fleet at least moved a little bit. So even if we're talking about equipment with solid rubber tires, because even those can get flats on them if they stick around too long in one place. Am I right?
Yeah, they get flats, and then they also, depending where you park them, they can sink into the ground pretty easily too.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Okay. Right. There's another question here. Would you recommend simulating the ground operation by operating GSE as in a standby mode? I think that's basically exercising the equipment.
I think, Steve, much like me and Lee have kind of mentioned, is that periodic starting of the equipment may, in some cases, if you can't operate it for a long enough period of time, actually draw batteries and things down more than running them can actually recharge the batteries for them. So I think everyone needs to think into their fleet and how many pieces of equipment they have, and is that the right choice for them? Some people will be lucky and have a small fleet, and they'll keep most of their equipment running, like Lee has suggested. If you've got a large fleet, managing that rotation is something you'll have to work out with your teams and what is possible, I think, based on your available manpower.
Okay. Yeah. Do you think that there's any other points on return to service, Lee? Have you? I'm sort of thinking now. How do you see your getting the message that you're coming back to service? I mean, being part of an airline, hopefully they're going to be telling you that they're going to be starting a schedule again. But I can imagine some of the other people. It might be quite a bit of a scramble. How do you see this picture playing out?
Steve, it's going to be an interesting picture because even being part of an airline, one of the things, like I mentioned before, we're learning is that it's not about the flight schedule right now. It's about how many people are actually on board a plane. And, until we start to see those numbers ramp up, we may start having to bring back equipment before we even bring back flight numbers because, as the guest numbers rise on the actual planes, we may need to put more belt loaders in service, more bag carts, tractors, things like that. I think that one thing that, handling companies probably need to make sure that airlines are clear on is that you will need a period. It's not like you can get a phone call on a Friday and be ready by a Monday at a major operation, a small base maybe, but a major operation, you're going to need a couple, 3, maybe even 4 weeks to get yourself back into operational status, get the staff retrained, and I do think that that's something that, handling companies should be making sure they're clear to airlines.
Yeah, the other thing that has been raised in some of our correspondence has been the issue of airside vehicle passes or airside vehicle permits. And the question of trying to keep those valid or an arrangement with the airport that these will be recognized even if the PMIs are a little behind or that the schedule itself hasn't been followed to the letter because of the extended schedule. So is that a situation that you have there? Lee?
Sorry, I missed that, Steve.
Sorry. It was the issue of the airside vehicle permits or airside vehicle passes and the validity of those for equipment that hasn't necessarily had its PMI. Is that an issue that you would be experiencing? I believe it is with some people. And have you set out to make arrangements with the airport for some kind of relaxation of that?
So that's not something that's a huge issue in Canada. Most of our airports, like we do have some that require stickers or permits for the vehicles, but that's more so them understanding that you have the insurance in place and who owns what on the air side. Most of them aren't getting into that. We do have one airport in Canada that's just kind of getting to that, but it's not an annual thing. It's a time limit on the age of equipment, and at 7 years from new, you have to have a major inspection done by a third party to prove that it's still safe. So in Canada, like I say, that's at this time not a huge issue, but hopefully airports are willing to work with people on getting this stuff back in service without being too much of a roadblock.
Great. Okay. Yeah. Anyway, we're getting towards the end of our session here. Lee, have you got any sort of final thoughts for wrapping up the session there, and Kevin as well?
Steve, I got one more point that Mike Green actually sent me in a text here, and it's a valid one, is the safety interlock serviceability. So any units that have, the new crash systems on them and crash prevention systems and any sensors, things like that, all need to be verified to make sure they are functioning.
Yeah, good point. We don't want to smack the aircraft the first time we get back onto back into operations.
Yeah, because we forgot there was a bird's nest in the sensor or something like that. So I thought I'd mention that. Otherwise, I'm good.
Great. Kevin, from your side?
I think just remembering for everybody, right? Safety is the most important thing we can have. So making sure we have safe equipment and safe operations of that equipment. Making a plan. How do you want to recover from this, and how do you want to deal with that? It's a great opportunity, right, for people to take account of their fleets and really record what work needs to be done. If they have the ability, obviously, to have those spare parts ready to go when we go back into service, or even making changes during this time that is unique. And then once we get back to service, again, making sure we do that in a safe manner, and then reaching out, obviously, if you need help, almost all manufacturers will be available to support you. And don't be afraid to reach out to your industry colleagues. They will also be there for you.
Great. Thank you very much. Yes, we will be there. Contact your manufacturer. You've got the ground operations, groundops@iata.org. And if we don't have the answers, we can push that around in the industry and try and help you with that. Great.
Hi, Steve. Steve, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
This is Romy.
Ah, Romy.
Yes, I've been listening. I heard jet fuel, and that's it. So I'm so sorry that we had technical problem with my laptop, but I would like to introduce myself, Romy Uloa. I work in the Technical Service Department in Safety and Flight Operations.
Yeah, we did have a couple of questions. There was one about recommendations for hydrant service vehicles and fuel system. Do you have anything on that? I think they talk about the fuel system for fueling the aircraft in that question. Would you like to answer that one?
But what exactly do you have? Because we currently, just to give you a little bit of background, currently we're having the biggest issue of parked and aircraft. And the reason why is that some of the big hubs will have difficulty if they need to have a defueling process. Does the airport has enough vehicles to support that? And if so, will we have issues with the biocide implications? Because not every, I don't know if you know about it, but one of the biocide that is cased on FP 1.5 is no longer produced. So we have one left that is biobore. And biobore in the European, luckily Germany has opened an exceptional authority to accept biobore for the aircraft in Germany. But in the rest of the states, the biobore is not a biocide that has been registered in the EU list of approved biocide. So what happens is that it might not be even allowed to be used unless the state authorities will have an exception like Germany did. Mm-hmm. So those are things that we're looking into it currently. And if you have any questions related with that, I can absolutely take it outside and draft a letter so that you can distribute it to your community to give. Because now we're doing a task force with the OEMs, engineer manufacturer, test manufacturer, the airlines, the regulatory. Yeah.
Romy, thanks for that. The other question that has arisen is, I take it that there's a fair amount of storage of aircraft fuel in the fuel trucks. What should we do? What should be done with that? Should the fuel be drained, if possible, of course? Should be topped off? What should be done under those circumstances?
It all depends on the location. It all depends on the weather condition. It all depends on what fuel are you putting inside the trucks or the hydrants or the bowsers. It's not you need to know what you're putting and what you're going to use it for, because if you're going to destroy the fuel, it might be a good fuel. So it costs a lot of money just to destroy that good fuel. So you need to make sure that you have a great discussion with the airlines that are on site, the regulatory bodies that are giving you some indication, and also the OEMs. So it's a community effort now, especially because it might be a point that we are all going to have to find a solution for defueling if it's necessary, and if it has to be. That's the last option that we want to do, but if it has to be, then we have to have the proper tools to do it, and not all the airports have it.
Great. Okay. Thanks very much for that. Yeah, we're just about out of time now. Thank you very much, everybody, for your questions. And I just want to remind you again, this is how to contact our ground operations team, groundops@iata.org. We've also included the reference site for fuel, www.iata.org/fuel. And you can see how to get hold of our guidelines on the ground operations page on IATA.org. And now I would just like to ask Joseph Swedan, Head of Ground Operations, to conclude the webinar. And Joseph, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you, our speakers, for being in there. But I would like to go back to thank the audience as well. On the questions and answers that we have been performed, are really a great question and answers that we take back with us. And our takeaway with this return to service is recommendation to keep doing our own risk assessment and keep performing safety and operational check on our equipment. And we really need to focus on the training, which is the most essential part, and the equipment certifications on that prior of being fit to operate. I would like to thank, as I stated before, our speakers, Kevin and Lee, for taking the time out of their busy business, which are in crisis, to help us by agreeing to be on the panel. We really appreciate your inputs a lot. I would like to also thank our strategic partners on all other industry partners and our airline members who have helped us compile our guidelines. The IATA Ground Ops team, of course, and in particular, Steve Savage, for preparing and moderating the session. Thanks, Steve. Our training and marketing teams who have supported us with the webinar, providing the platform and the support to keep it all going. Don't forget to follow our training page on IATA website. Please see the link. The link is there for the new courses that are actually being under development. And finally, a reminder to you all, please complete the short survey that will be sent out to you. It will help us to help you. Please stay healthy and stay safe. Thank you very much for being on the call.